Surrogacy, it's incredibly inclusive, and we have every possible type of individual as an intended parent. And then the surrogates themselves are a very diverse group of people. I mean, they are really just every single size, shape, and color that there is.
Welcome to the Surrogacy Scoop, a podcast brought to you by Patriot Conceptions, where we demystify the world of surrogacy from the clinical, family, and surrogate perspective. I'm your host, CJ, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Daniel A. Potter. Dr. Potter is a renowned reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist at HRC Fertility, practicing in Newport Beach and Fullerton. Dr. Potter is the recipient of several prestigious awards, including the Vitals Compassionate Doctor of the Year Award, Patient's Choice Award, Inland Empire's Best Doctor, and Top Doctor for the past 5 years by Los Angeles Magazine, as well as being named annually as one of America's top obstetricians and gynecologists since 2005. Dr. Potter, specializing in IVF, is known for maximizing pregnancy rates with personalized care. He is a strong advocate for reproductive freedom and equality, supporting compensated egg donation, compensated surrogacy, and single and same-sex parenting. Additionally, Dr. Potter was chairman of the Medical Advisory Board for the American Fertility Association and author or co-author of dozens of peer-reviewed scientific articles. Thank you, Dr. Potter, for joining us on the Surrogacy Scoop.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you and hopefully getting information out to your listeners that's useful to them. I'm board certified in obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility, and I practice here in Newport Beach, California. And I first became interested in medicine as a young man. My father was a physician. You know, he was an obstetrician, and I saw what a difficult lifestyle that was. So I was pretty certain I didn't want to do that. But unfortunately, when I took the rotation as a medical student, I had just an incredible experience. My very first day on the service, I walk onto the floor in scrubs, and you're kind of excited to be in scrubs. You've been reading books for 2 years, not really seeing patients too much. So I'm excited to, finally be getting into the action. And I walk onto the labor and delivery floor, and there's nobody there. And everybody's back in deliveries because USC was a crazy busy place back at the time. And a saloon door opens up, from the OR, and this head pops out. And it was this guy, Melvin Thornton, who is also a fertility doctor, ironically. And he looked around and he saw me and he shook his head and he looked around trying to find someone else. And he said, "Hey, you get in here and deliver this baby. I have to go do a C-section." And so I went into this room and there was myself, who had never delivered a baby. There was an 18 or 19-year-old, indigent immigrant who didn't speak any English and had never had a baby. And then there was a delivery nurse who had probably delivered, 100 babies or at least. And so, we went through it, and it was just such a beautiful experience. The mother was just so in the zone and just so together. And it was, she cried, I cried. It was just such a beautiful experience. And I just knew at that point that I really wanted to help, women have babies. And then in terms of fertility, it sort of crystallized when I had experience in our fertility clinic, which was it was a taxpayer funded clinic for, essentially illegal immigrants to have babies, which seems kind of insane. And I was a little bit, I don't know, jaded by the whole prospect of that. And then I encountered a patient who at the time was kind of like about my age exactly, mid-20s. And she had, been experiencing infertility. And, it was explaining to me, in Spanish, because everybody, speaks Spanish at the county pretty much, that, how this was impacting her life and her marriage, and, how from a cultural point of view, she, her husband's maybe going to leave her if she can't have children, and all of her friends already have children. And the system at the county was just so Byzantine. And the problem that she had wasn't that complicated, a PCOS, but I knew if I didn't intervene, there's no way she would navigate the system and have a happy ending to this. So I decided that I was going to make it my mission to make sure that this lady had a baby. And, I was only on the service for 2 weeks. So, I basically, even when I was off the service, I sort of walked her through and made sure that she had all her appointments. And ultimately, she was able to get pregnant and have a baby. And that was just a really affirming experience for me, to help a woman or a family or any individual that wants to have a child, achieve that dream. It was just incredibly satisfying. And I realized that, this was the path that I was going to take for my life and my career. So,
So now that we have a little bit of insight about how you got here, you have worked in both academic settings and in private practice. How do you feel like these experiences shape the way that you approach your work and fertility treatments today?
well, I think that, academics gives you like a curiosity to look at new things and explore new technologies. And so that's something I've done throughout my career. I was very curious initially about gender selection. And so I worked as the medical director for Microsort, which was a startup that used flow cytometry to sort sperm into male and female aliquots. And then I started working with what became Natera as their laboratory director and did a lot of the initial work with them and, participated. And when I say participated, it's sort of like being the kicker on the football team because all these scientists and, really smart people are developing this technology. But it was amazing to participate in all that and, and see it all happen. And so, that I would say that that's probably the biggest thing about being coming from an academic fellowship and having a really strong academic advisor and Dr. Bob Schenken. It just instills a curiosity, looking at, trying to always look for new things and apply new technologies in a way that will help our patients achieve success. So I guess at the end of the day, I've just always been mostly interested in trying to optimize success rates. And so yeah, so that's that.
Yeah, that's really interesting insight. We have had a couple people on the podcast who kind of have both that academic and then practice balance. It's always so interesting to hear how they interact and how you kind of take the strengths from each. I don't know, I don't want to say side of your brain, but maybe side of your work to influence and help the others. Kind of along that same rabbit hole a little bit, you have been a part of some pretty groundbreaking fertility research. I guess, how do you stay at the forefront of that, or how do you balance those studies that you've done, the new treatments and technologies, with the fact that this is a very rapidly advancing field?
I mean, it's pretty difficult not to get left behind. I mean, you have to really stay up on things.
Mhm.
Fortunately for me, a few years ago, we incorporated the academic department at the University of Southern California School of Medicine into our practice. And so Dr. Paulson is now our medical director, and he provides a lot of academic stimulation. We have journal clubs. Right before this call, I was on a call about big conference call with all of our practice on it about two new experimental protocols that we're going to be looking at to hopefully, help our patients, achieve
Wow.
pregnancy more easily and less expensively. So, yeah. So, I mean, my direct academic work is really not what it used to be in terms, I'm mostly a clinician these days, but I would say mostly surrounding yourself with smart people and listening to them and being curious and also being very skeptical, when you're looking at the scientific literature, trying to pick it apart, trying to see what the biases were exactly. So, just to, I'd say that kind of background is sort of, it has been really helpful.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. We've had a couple clinicians on the podcast, and the how rapidly this industry changes is absolutely something that comes up every single time, whether I bring it up like this time or not. It just seems like something that is really intense and you have to be really on top of. But again, this is a very serious industry. A lot of people
Yeah, well,
are
one thing that's kind of interesting I can say is that pretty much nothing I do on a daily basis, I mean, virtually, none of this technology even existed when I was in medical school. So,
right.
one of the things that is, I have a good perspective on is that, the whole purpose of education is to prepare you to think in the future. It's not sort of saying like, okay, everything. Now you're ready to go out there. It's basically to prepare your mind to incorporate new ideas and to think about new techniques and all that. So if you look at, when I was training, I mean, ICSI had barely, it's been done maybe a handful of times, PGT, maybe a handful of cases, there in IVF itself, we didn't even know how to grow blastocyst back then. So, there's just been so much progress. But, when you look back at, say, the 20 or 30 years before I started medical school, I mean, they started working on this in 1960, 1959 in animals. And so people had an idea a long time ago, and it's really taken a long time for us to figure out, took a long time for them to figure out the basics of, human embryology and how to grow embryos. And, so there's just been incredible progress and change. And, that has manifested itself in, you know, the sort of uniformly outstanding pregnancy rates that we see here in the United States, at this time. And, I think it's going to continue to get better. And there are many areas of research that are really, really intriguing and, I think hold a lot of promise in the future, particularly in the field of genetic testing. I think there's a lot to do there in terms of identifying and preventing things that predispose people to serious illnesses like diabetes and things of that nature. There are also some, there's exciting, research in non-humans using CRISPR to edit the genomic message or and, that's exciting as well. So, I mean, when you could delete or insert information, that's pretty exciting. And then something else that's pretty new that I'm really just familiarizing myself with, but it's, I think, something I'm going to be, spending a lot of time reading about and hopefully finding a way to participate and research in is, looking at how the methylation patterns on DNA can be transmitted from parent to offspring. And, that's really exciting because you have all these genes, every single cell you have has all the DNA that you have in it. It has every single gene in it, and you have to know how to turn these things on and off so that, a skin cell's a skin cell or what have you. And so it's pretty interesting that a lot of that is done through methylation, and that to some degree, some of these things could be, transmitted and, in an inheritable way. So that's interesting and something that I, in the early stages of, trying to get my head around and seeing who's doing the good work and, see if we can poke our nose into that and try to get involved.
Yeah, that is, I think you just provided $1 million insight to our audience here, just about how much this stuff does change and how clinicians really have to be on top of it. And also, maybe the elasticity that you have to work and be successful in this industry. Change and new things is really scary for a lot of people, but that's kind of what this demands. Yeah, and I think that's,
I mean, because there's not really a book, like there's not a book where you could buy a book and it says like, here's how you do an IVF cycle.
yep.
And one of the things that I find interesting is that, if you look at clinicians like myself that have been really busy for like a long time, we're not sitting there around, kibitzing and stuff very often, but when we do get together and you hear what other people are doing and have kind of arrived at through, like just experience, a lot of it anecdotal, we all end up kind of at the same place, or close to it. So it's pretty interesting. But I do think that there are still many areas of reproductive medicine that are ripe for development. And I still think that there are areas that are going to have a big impact on our patients, particularly, in the area of, diminished ovarian reserve and, just, disease prevention and, just optimization of outcomes. Looking at embryos, like they're, as we get more and more granular data on embryos. And so now they're starting to sequence the entire genome of embryos. And as we can accumulate that kind of data, I mean, potentially there are patterns that are not readily identifiable that, we can use AI, or in the old days, we use like color mapping or different techniques to try to find patterns to match up that, might be associated with like a poor outcome or a good outcome, or, certain conditions like, I don't know, diabetes, which are factorial. So anyway, so that's pretty exciting stuff. And but there's a lot to do. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of very, very smart people that have been attracted to our field because of that and are, working, diligently on it. So
Yeah, that's incredible. Again, like I said, $1 million insights here. Kind of continuing along that, maybe, as we kind of talk about all these things that are changing or things that are progressing, you have been an advocate for reproductive freedom. We know that you've made many appearances on various media platforms. How do you balance your clinical work with these public advocacy efforts?
I mean, it's pretty easy. These things don't take a lot of time. I mean, it's, maybe it's an hour out of your day every now and again. And it's just part of the job. Part of our job is education and advocacy. When a patient walks through this door right over here and sits in this chair across from me for the first time, like at that moment, they're basically hiring me to be their advocate. I'm their advocate. I'm there to help them have a child, to help them achieve parenthood. And, so it's sort of the same thing, but just in a larger scale. So anytime there's an opportunity to help get information out there, I have found, and I say this to pretty much every patient that I see, that one of the real keys is gathering, the appropriate amount of information so that the patient themselves can be in a position to make an informed decision. And when I say an informed decision, what that looks like is, 5 or 10 years down the road, you could look back at this moment in time and you don't have regrets. It's not like, oh my God, why didn't they tell me about this? If I would have known about this then, I never would have done this. Like that kind of stuff drives me nuts. And that is what happens when people are making, uninformed decisions. The other thing is that, what I do is, I help to gather all this information. I help to interpret it and present it to the patient so that they can understand it. And I may make recommendations, but ultimately everything we do is elective. People can do nothing and they're not going to die. It's not like cancer treatment. And so, patients, as long as they hear all the facts, like ultimately they're intelligent adults and they're entitled to control their lives and decide, what's right for them and their family. And, it may or may not be what I recommend, but, my job is to first, educate and inform the patient, put them in a position to sorry about that,
No problem.
to make an informed decision. And then once they've decided, what it is they're going to do, the next piece of this is just execution. And for us, executing the plan is the easy part. That's the part I've probably done 10,000 times. People could, if that are in my position have just, done it so many times, like that's simple for us. It's obviously the most complicated part for the patient because they've never done this before. And there's a lot of moving parts for them with shots and schedules and appointments and things. So
You made a really good point there about gathering and providing education. Maybe kind of alongside that, if this isn't even in the same realm, how do you think that surrogacy can be made more accessible and inclusive to a diverse range of families or individuals?
it's a very tough thing because, surrogates are scarce, and, here in the United States, we have a relatively libertarian viewpoint on reproduction for the most part, I, I would say that the majority of Americans, like, for example, with abortion, like people have different views on that. But, you could be pro-life and pro-choice. You don't have to, like the difference being that, like, you don't need to impose your views on other people. Like, they're entitled to their opinions and their views, and it's their lives, to make these decisions. With surrogacy, originally, there was just a lot of pushback on surrogacy. There was a lot of negativity out there about it. And it's been nice to see over the last, nearly 30 years to sort of see that mostly dissipate. And now it's not unusual. It's American culture now, which is really phenomenal. I mean, and it's taken 20 or 30 years, or 30 really. Surrogacy, like, to make it more available to people, that would probably involve insurance covering it, or, the government paying for it on some level. That's going to be a much more difficult thing to accomplish. And part of the reason the United States has, I don't know, relatively libertarian stances on things like gender selection and surrogacy, same-sex parenting, because they're like, oh, well, I would say half of the surrogacy cases we do are, same-sex couples, is that in the other countries, the government's paying for everything for the most part. So when people are using their own money here in the United States, at least, I mean, unless you're harming somebody else, I mean, most of the time people are okay with letting people do, what they want, as long as it's ethical and, not illegal. And in other countries where the government, pays for healthcare, even in countries that are not socialist countries like Australia, which is not a socialist country, but has, kind of a socialized medical program, like, the government doesn't want to go down that path and get stuck having to pay for all this stuff with a scarce resource, public money that needs to pay for healthcare for everybody. So, so it's just an interesting thing, but I feel like we've developed it much better here in the United States because we have basically, a free market where the government hasn't really been involved in this aspect of reproductive medicine. That's starting to change, and we'll see how that impacts things, but, hopefully not in a negative way. But it's very difficult because surrogacy, as you know, it's very expensive.
Yep.
And, looking for alternative ways to do that. I don't know what they'd have in the future. I don't think anything like an artificial womb or any of that kind of stuff is going to happen, during this century, and we're not really that far along in this century. So, that's a hard one. I don't have a good answer to. I would say making people understand, what it is, the surrogacy is available and who needs it. I would say awareness to people that are potential surrogates that, this is a situation where, potentially you can help someone else and help yourself at the same time. And I think the key is, creating an environment where you have, a win, like a relationship between the intended parents and the surrogate. Anytime these relationships get one-sided, it obviously isn't a healthy thing. Uh, but, if it's a win-win, that's the best possible kind of thing to have in any kind of situation or deal where everybody is benefiting.
Yeah, that emphasis on education, I think, is maybe the most practical thing that we can do. Obviously, this is a podcast, we're not in the practice rooms themselves, but education and awareness. And like you mentioned, most people, at least most people I know in my personal life, know about surrogacy because of reality TV. So it's slowly becoming something that more people are aware of, and that awareness is probably the first step to getting it in front of more people and therefore available to more people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably it. And then, you know, the thing about surrogates right now is that the supply and demand, supply versus demand. I mean, there's much more demand than there is supply right now. And so, you could probably improve things by just, improve, if there's a way to try to improve the supply of surrogates, that would be probably the only meaningful thing that we could actually accomplish that I can think about right now that would help make it more accessible to more people. Because as you have more and more surrogates, then I think the cost would probably come down a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point as well. Maybe as we kind of continue down this educational rabbit hole we're going down, I have a couple myths here that I would like to hear your opinions on, maybe debunking or, whatever your professional opinion leads us to.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the first one I have here is IVF babies are more likely to have birth defects.
Mm, I mean, there's no meaningful studies that demonstrate that. I mean, there have been studies in the past where they publish things like that. Typically, these studies are published by epidemiologists. And when you're reading the medical literature, you need to always be skeptical. So I'm skeptical of all those things. As far as IVF, if you use the current process that we have in place for in vitro fertilization, it is the fact that you'll have a higher probability of having a healthy child than if you don't use it, just simply by the virtue that we're going to be eliminating all the various aneuploidies that could be associated with an abnormal live-born baby, So that right there, I think debunks that myth.
100%. My next one here is if a woman has multiple failed IVF cycles, it is always her fault. And maybe alongside of that, how do you work with patients to determine the root cause if there is a failed IVF cycle?
Well, I mean, obviously, well, first of all, I mean, saying anybody's at fault for infertility or, any of that, I mean, it's not only not helpful, but I mean, it could be harmful. And in this case, I mean, it's not, I mean, is it your fault the way you were born? Is it your fault, like that you are how you are? I mean,
Mm.
I don't think you can take characteristics that people have that are immutable and try to make them feel bad about that. I don't care what characteristic that is. That's just terrible, terrible behavior. So, but the fact is when someone has multiple IVF cycles that have failed, I mean, it could be could be nobody's fault. Everybody could be doing everything perfectly well. And you just have a case where you have just a very poor prognosis patient that has a very low probability for success. Like if your chances for success are 1 out of 10, I mean, you're going to fail most of the time and it's not your fault. Everybody can perform perfectly. And basically what it comes down to is you get your shot, you have your 1 in 10 shot and it comes up in the, comes up negative. So, yeah, so it's never the patient's fault unless they're actively trying to sabotage the cycle and not following their doctor's directions. When people have failed IVF, I think it's always important to go back and look at the case. And so, people have different methods for doing that. When patients have all of their pre-testing done and we formulate the initial protocol, that initial testing we have is not a crystal ball by any measure. Okay. But it's the best thing we have in 2025. And so in order to predict how someone might respond to certain protocols. So we use that information to formulate a protocol. And fortunately, most of the time, I'd say the protocols are really right on or almost right on, like in the bullseye or in the thing to ring right out from it. Sometimes you need to make adjustments. And, if someone has a failed IVF cycle, I like to start at the end and sort of unwind it and go backwards, kind of go backwards and get to the beginning. And then I like play it forward again. And it kind of helps me see how all the moving parts relate to one another to kind of go backwards and see how it comes apart and then watch how it goes back together. So that's how I do it. There are many different little tweaks that can be done. There's a lot of different knobs on this, I guess you could say. And so, you have to sit there and adjust them and get them just right. And hopefully you get it really close or right on the first time. But if you don't, going back and looking sometimes when you do that review, the conclusion is that, everything was really optimal here. And I don't think there's anything more that can be done. Like, this is just how it is for you, for this given set of physiologic circumstances that we are dealing with. Like, this is what we're going to expect. This is probably the best we're going to be able to expect each time. And, when we're in a situation like that, where the response hasn't been great, maybe someone only has a few eggs or something, I think it's important to reach that point for them and let them really understand, like, hey, this is how it's going to look if you want to keep doing this. So, and this is a very important issue for them, something they've typically been working on for many, years typically. And so if you're at a point where, we can see that this path, and, I love analogies. And so one of the analogies I like to use is when the patient comes in, like, their goal is like to get to the other side of this valley, and that's parenthood. And the valley is like full of fog, and there's different pathways, and we don't really know where any of those pathways lead. And finding out that one of those pathways leads to nowhere, like, and sometimes that's the unfortunate truth for people that, have poor ovarian reserve, that, it's just not realistic for you to use your own eggs. I think that that's a compassionate thing to do for people, because, at the very least, you're putting them in a position where you're telling them the truth, and they can make decisions based on that, or they could find a different doctor or what have you that maybe has a different perspective on it. But, telling them the truth is really one of the most compassionate things you can do, because I'm their advocate. I don't want to see people suffer. And when you go through this process, and I don't know your story, but, when you're going through infertility on your own before you've even seen a doctor, there's an excitement. Hey, we're trying. And then it's like that, okay, not this month. And then after that sort of starts stacking up, and maybe some of your friends start getting pregnant, it's really hard every time that period comes, every time that you're unsuccessful. It's like a boxing match where you're getting punched in the body, and, eventually that wears people out. And if you look at studies in countries where IVF is free, like in Scandinavia, there was a study a number of years ago, and they could do IVF as many times as they want back then. They didn't even really have a lot of age restrictions in place, and people would quit. People burn out on failure. The other problem is in that market environment where you have the government paying for IVF, the pregnancy rates are uniformly horrible because there's no financial incentive to be great, you know? So people burn out. And so I don't uh, dismiss the impact that failure has on people and how it makes them feel, how it affects their relationships with their partners and their family and their coworkers and their friends and just the world in general. So I try to be cognizant of that. I want to protect my patients and I want to get them to where they need to go. But, if that path that we thought we wanted to go down on, like, now we can see the end of it and it's a cliff, like, it's not going to the other side. So let's find one that will get there. And that happens with surrogacy. What we're talking about today was, surrogacy. I mean, that's a difficult thing. It's not difficult for same-sex male partners because they don't have a uterus, but for couples that have, a female that's planning on carrying a baby, there's a lot of things that go into that decision. And as much as there's a relief for a lot of these patients that there's hope still, there's also a mourning process that they have to go through because, their whole, lives, their lives up until this point. Like they've always imagined this since they were little girls, even probably seeing pregnant women. They've imagined this process being a certain way, and that this is kind of part of what what you do. And sometimes they feel like failures when they have to resort to surrogacy. And, it's very difficult. I feel like this, surrogacy, it's really a second life. It's a second chance. It's a happy thing, but and nearly all couples get to that point, where they feel that way. But there's always that initial, you know, just disappointment and sorrow, pain, sometimes anger, like all the different parts of grieving. They will go through all those things. Disbelief is usually obviously the first one. Anger, disbelief, bargaining, it's all in there, and we see it over and over again. So
Yeah, I think something that you kind of mentioned a couple times throughout that answer, and I think this is a good place to leave our audience on too, is that surrogacy, obviously this process is always evolving, but it generally is evolving in a positive direction. And it does offer a lot of people hope that they wouldn't have had otherwise previously, or maybe in different countries, like you mentioned, different places of the world. So maybe as we kind of wrap up today, maybe sticking along that through line of hope, or however you want to take this question, is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience from your perspective as a leading provider in this industry?
you were nice enough to provide me with a list of some things that that you were interested in talking about. And one of the things that we hadn't gotten about was diversity and inclusion in surrogacy. And I was thinking about that, and I feel that surrogacy, it's incredibly inclusive right now. I mean, the only exclusion is financial, essentially. And we have every possible type of, of, of individual as an intended parent. And then the surrogates themselves are a very diverse group of people. I mean, they are really just every single size, shape, and color that there is. And then on the intended parent side, I mean, we have single women, we have single men, we have, every combination that you can possibly have. I mean, we have, so it is very diverse, and it's very inclusive, except for the financial part. And I that's a really difficult one to try to figure out how, we get around. I mean, I think that it would be wonderful to have some kind of charity. So I have an ex-employee who did very well for herself, and her husband's they did very well. And they set up a family foundation and a charity to help fund IVF for people that couldn't afford it, which I thought was amazing. So you're basically taking people that are economically disadvantaged, and you're, it's sort of like being Willy Wonka and giving someone like the chocolate factory. I mean, you find a couple, you're just like, we've got it all covered for you. This is going to happen. That's pretty wonderful. Doing something like that with surrogacy obviously takes a lot more money, but that would be pretty amazing, because that's really the only thing that holds back people that might need surrogacy, might have to have surrogacy, but can't access it.
Awesome. That is, I think, a very incredible note of inspiration to leave us with today. Yeah, and especially I really appreciate you highlighting the diverse nature of surrogacy. I'm sure you could go back and listen, through all of our episodes. We've had a very wide range of different kinds of people on the podcast, and I think that just highlights your point. So thank you again for bringing that up. As always, more information about HRC Fertility and their services will be available in their show notes. Thank you so much, Dr. Potter, for your time today. I really appreciate hearing your perspective on the podcast. I think our audience will find this.
And, it's my pleasure. And I hope that your listeners and viewers have found this to be helpful. And, I'd love to come back sometime.
Awesome. Yes, we will have to do a round two. We could have gone down like a million different rabbit holes today. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
All right, you bet. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Surrogacy Scoop, and I hope you found value in this meaningful conversation. For all resources mentioned in the episode, or to connect with Patriot Conceptions online, visit the description. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast hosting platform, and share this episode with those in your life who may be interested in getting involved.